Now, last year saw the fastest annual rise in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere.
Now in South Africa, 50,000 people are being evacuated from their homes as wildfires spread across Cape Town's Table Mountain.
At least 18 people have died in floods and landslides caused by days of torrential rain in South Korea.
Climate change is no longer a scientific forecast. It's a daily reality for a lot of people in the global south. Crops are failing, cities are flooding, and wildfires are no longer isolated events. Yet, only a fraction of climate finance goes toward climate adaptation solutions. So why does adaptation remain so drastically underfunded? And what does it take to make profitable VC investments in climate adaptation solutions? To unpack this complex topic, today we are joined by Timothy Rann, managing partner at Mercy Corp Ventures. Timothy has led over 70 investments in emerging markets with one goal: to build real climate resilience where it matters most. You are listening or watching to VCO2, the show that helps you become a smarter impact investor and a better climate tech entrepreneur. And before we start, please don't forget to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you are on YouTube, or to give us a 5-star review and a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This really helps the show, so thank you for those that will do it. And let's dive in. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. And I guess the topic of the day is to talk about adaptation versus mitigation, which I think adaptation is quite overlooked. But maybe before we start, can you give me a definition of those two topics and what do we mean and what are the type of companies we find in those two sectors?
The way we really think about it is not a adaptation versus mitigation argument, but to really, address the specter of climate change, which is really, impacting us today. We really need a portfolio of interventions, approaches, investments that, fit in both those categories. So when we look at adaptation and resilience, there's, long definitions we can dive into, and my impact management and measurement person will condemn me if I get these incorrect. But instead of parsing hairs, I think the way we really look at it is, what are the types of technologies, business models, interventions that help people, communities, cities, nations to plan, respond, and then recover for climate stresses and shocks? So that might be from an event like a hurricane, it could be from a drought, could be from high levels of heat, any number of the things we associate with climate change. And so any of these interventions, technologies, business models that effectively allow these communities, companies, what have you, stakeholders, to anticipate them, to respond to them and recover is what we're looking for. And so, happy to dive into more around like specific business models. But I mean, to go through, a few of the key risks we probably all know or have all heard about. When we look at something like, say, wildfires, which we tend to think of quite a bit in, say, California in the news, a bit in Europe as well, in Spain and so forth. Actually, Latin America had the highest number of recorded wildfires last year. Even in where I'm based in Quito, had numerous friends having to evacuate their houses in downtown Quito because of wildfires, something we has really never happened before in the last decade, but increasingly happening so with longer droughts. There are technologies, of course, available that allow citizens to have better early warning systems. So if a wildfire hotspot could emerge, that could, not only warn firefighters to better act, address it, could also warn citizens nearby that they should probably, leave their house. That data can be used for insurance and risk transfer, which then, allows homeowners to be protected in the case of a fire affects their house or livelihood.
And just to make sure it's clear for everyone, what about mitigation? What are the type of companies we find in mitigation?
So mitigation is pretty straightforward, and we're looking at companies that are essentially trying to mitigate our carbon emissions at this very time. So what are companies that are, allowing us to reduce our emissions within, say, our supply chains, construction, real estate. What our companies are allowing us to remove actual carbon, methane from the atmosphere. I think one of the advantages on the mitigation side is that, easily measurable. Carbon is a molecule. We're getting quite good at measuring it, even soon measuring it, completely from space, anticipating it. And then secondarily, a lot of the interventions are typically assets or are kind of well understood by major industries. And so it really allows us as human species to more easily envision and calculate the effectiveness of these. But then secondarily, it's relatively easily financeable. And so a lot of these mitigation endeavors kind of fit in with kind of business as normal and allows capital to flow to them.
And why is it that we are not able to finance the insurance, for example, for wildfire? Because obviously we are good at, measuring CO2, right? But actually, I think it's actually easier for me to see the effect of a wildfire than it is to see the effect today of the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, right? So like, it's actually for me more tangible in terms of like a wildfire destruct homes, destruct cities, destruct nature, moves animals, kills animals, like all of those effects, right? But why is it that we're not able to finance it today?
First, I would say that a lot of the effects of climate change, a lot of those stresses and shocks I was mentioning before, are most easily felt in the global south. So Africa, Latin America, where we do a lot of our work, where I'm based. A lot of the stresses and shocks, whether it's wildfire, drought, increased heat, excess rainfall, all these things, they're really happening in that tropical belt. They're really happening in these communities. And so I think to some degree, until, a little bit more recently, a lot of the actual effects are felt in these places, a bit far away from, the capital providers and people in the global north. And so a bit of out of sight, out of mind. And so we hear stories around like, will we have chocolate? Will we have these things? And that brings it a bit closer to home. But ultimately, it's a bit further away. So we're starting to see these more catastrophic events in the global north. And of course, that allows people to get a bit more passionate about it and maybe care a bit more about it. But from a capital flow perspective, I mean, if we take a step back and look at the money spent in like one category of mitigation around, say, direct air capture and alternative proteins, alternative meat, we are looking at, I think, a total of around $16 billion in lab-grown meat alone over the last 5 years. DAC's a bit harder to measure, but U.S. government alone plowed about $4 billion and probably about another $1 billion of private capital flowing into it. And part of that is, largely because you have assets that are financeable. Secondarily, you have kind of government signals like indicating, price. Third, you have kind of consumer-led products, which I think from a venture capital perspective allows you to look at the type of growth that you need. And then beyond that, I mean, I think there's a degree to which that there's a bit of a bias that adaptation is kind of a public good and should be driven by governments. And so these are hard things to finance. They're hard to be bakeable. There's a lot of risk. And I think, want to dive into more why I think that's a bit misplaced. Adaptation, on the other hand, I mean, we're looking at currently about $20 billion of investments per year in adaptation, but the actual need for the emerging markets, global south, is somewhere around $300 to $350 billion a year. So there's a huge gap. And every year we don't address that, it just increases because a dollar today is, worth 10 tomorrow. And so, yeah, I mean, I think at this point, there's a huge gap between those. And I think, again, where we choose to see the future is that these things aren't mutually exclusive. We need really more of all of it. And the adaptation side, it's less around seeing this as a public good and a risk and more as an opportunity. So the way we look at it is, the global south, which is least responsible for kind of the climate crisis we're in and most affected by it, that's there. That's not changing for better or worse. I'm not going to have a moral argument about it. But ultimately, these are, hopefully humans we care about. And then secondarily, incredibly entrepreneurial, agile, thoughtful entrepreneurs exist in these places, and they're re-envisioning how their economies and systems have to work with these stresses and shocks. And they're really the most well-placed to actually think through, exactly what they can be. So their food systems, their insurance, financial systems, all these things, they know what's coming, and they're designing the systems and companies and, interventions that make sense to survive and thrive under it.
It drives me crazy a little bit that you mentioned that the only few things we actually care about as a global north is like chocolate and this type of things, which we actually can see the effect of climate change on in terms of like the price and everything, but like drives me a bit crazy. But anyway, I think maybe to go on the opportunity side, like do you have any numbers as far as like what a potential growth we could see? What are the potential companies, which markets, like anything there where if someone is listening and still debating in his head or in her head whether or not that's a great opportunity, what would you say to convince that person?
Yeah. So there was a great podcast with JP Morgan's head of climate advisory, I think last week or even this week. And she kind of pointed out that, the increasing evidence they're seeing is that, and I'm just going to read off my phone so I get it accurate, but maintaining the status quo with regards to thinking about climate adaptation can be costly and destroy value. I think what she's kind of saying is that we kind of look at climate adaptation, from especially JP Morgan, highest class of investors, is really risk mitigation, and something where again the government, public sector have to step in. But what the argument she's making, and it's based on a report from Jefferies that came out I think last week, is that their analysis looked at investors that are intentionally exposing themselves to and adopting and investing in adaptation solutions get total returns that are about 13.5% higher than those on mitigation strategies. And I think like the report goes into a lot of depth on the different rationales behind it. And it seems a bit esoteric, but I think fundamentally it's a lens by which I think any investor that has global exposure, which is pretty much every investor, now has to think about, well, is my supply chain resilient to the increasing stresses and shocks? If what I'm doing in my supply chain might not be enough to affect all the things that are happening outside of my supply chain or adjacent to it. And so applying that lens is not just useful or interesting or regulatory compliance. It's really how you get that delta to actually get ahead of the market. And so that's the way we look at it. And I think beyond that, from an emerging markets perspective, again, you might have a vested interest in a particular country because that's where you procure your coffee or Coke, whatever it is. And like for them, it's pretty obvious that investing in these solutions allows them to continue to procure and continue to exist. For others, there's socioeconomic, political reasons, right? I mean, if we don't find ways to address the collapse of water and agriculture in places like Iraq, Northern Africa, we can continue to see mass migration on a scale we've never known. In Latin America, farmers abandoning farms because they don't see them as viable anymore. We will reap the consequences of kind of ignoring it. And again, this gets back to one of the challenges, I think, when you asked earlier about why is it that we kind of overlook it? And it's that, a lot of adaptation investments do fit in the category of kind of a public good. And so the actual investment that, say, like an insurance company can make in agriculture, they might have some contribution to, say, stemming migration because of agricultural losses, but it's not really their core business, and it's something that really needs to be driven by a group. And so I think that's the challenge we have is like, what are those adaptation investments that are tangibly linked to, asset managers, corporations, and so forth? And then what are those where you need more of kind of a holistic support around it? So on specific companies in the adaptation and resilience space, like, again, you can kind of categorize it maybe by, say, disaster or opportunity. But the way I think we like to portray it is, again, what are the food systems in, say, Africa or Latin America going to look like 30 years from now? Climate is affecting it, but there's all sorts of other things. So with our food systems, the way we envision it in these countries is that, number one, every farmer is going to have access to some sort of form of insurance. We know this is probably the most crucial opportunity for farmers to invest more in their farms, increase their livelihoods, increase productivity. So we have one investment in a company called Pula that design and distribute agricultural insurance products across Africa. I think about 15 million farmers now around the world. Started in Nairobi, but now operating insurance policies around India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. And essentially the way they would describe themselves is they are that downside protection for farmers to take on more risk, move into climate-smart agriculture, and grow their livelihoods, which is fundamental. A second example would be, a company like Meridia in our portfolio, which is actually based here in the EU. Meridia is really solving for a really crucial gap in our ability to understand who our farmers are and how that commodity flows through a value chain. And that's really important for, regulatory, for European deforestation regulation. Secondarily, it's really important for making sure that corporations, Ecom, Olam, Starbucks, not only are they compliant with regulations, which are well-intentioned and aimed to decrease deforestation, but I think more importantly, how can they create that data infrastructure so that all those agricultural players can then more intelligently engage with those farmers? How can they channel investments that make those farmers more resilient out of self-interest? They want to get more cacao or whatever it is. Or secondarily, because they want to reduce their emissions and those farmers need to invest in their soil carbon, whatever it is. So yeah, two companies that we kind of look at, how are they creating resilience in these food systems, and how does that tech stack really come together that allows these farmers to rebuild a food system that is more inclusive, more productive, more resilient, more regenerative.
What is, according to you, the type of capital that these companies that you just mentioned, for example, need? Can a typical VC investors actually invest in these companies, or do you need to be backed by a family office with longer holding period, or does that need to be philanthropy investment? Like, what are the type of investors and type of capital that can go into this company?
I think in the adaptation space, it's a bit more fuzzy, to be honest. And so I think a lot of the struggles that private capital and governments and other actors have had is, well, what is an adaptation investment? What's actually bankable? What's not? And how do we, convince financiers to come into the right level of the stack? So I think a lot of progress has been made on that with like Gari and a few other actors. But the bankable slice of it, which would then incorporate, say, venture capitalists, development finance institutions, family offices, like those who are seeking returns of various degrees of the spectrum. I mean, I think there's companies where you can see, like, for instance, Pula originally started out with, let's say, family offices, small institutional investors like ourselves, other impact funds. That was kind of their initial journey. They went on to raise from, far more commercial venture capital funds in the US, EU, from British government, from a variety of others. So we usually see the capital continuum with these more tech-driven companies that are multi-region, typically follow that path, like, kind of the friends, families, and fools, small family offices, VCs, and then they move their chain up. For the others that I'd say are more in kind of the agriculture space or, it's more slow growth, venture capital at that early stage is probably the right call. I mean, they're not agriculture exits in emerging markets have never really gotten over the 3 to 10x, and that's just not going to be sufficient for a lot of global investors. And so I do think that it's connecting the right opportunities with the right capital. And one of the big mistakes in climate tech, investing in emerging markets the last, say, 10 years, has been kind of a one-size-fits-all of VCs coming into the space, not knowing the liquidity opportunities, and then, putting money in what is essentially just an ag SME. Great company, could spin off good dividends, be a great business for the right type of investor. But for a VC fund, it's not going to generate those returns.
And you mentioned earlier governments and regulations. What's the role of governments and institutions in terms of like pushing more investors into this type of solutions because they either incentivize the investment or they make the other type of investment look worse compared to it because of whatever reasons? Like, what's the role there of governments and regulation?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few layers. So, first and foremost, if we look at like the European Union, having regulations around SBTI, Scope 3 emissions, European deforestation regulation was very controversial. From my vantage point, it's critical because unless government establishes trade regulations that essentially send a signal and say, we do not want certain commodities that contribute to negative environmental incomes. If they don't do that, then it's business as normal. And so I commend EU for doing that, and that drives a whole market. It's creating an entire new market of companies that are having to think through or face huge fines. Where do their commodities come from? What are the emissions from it? Are we contributing to deforestation? How do we get that data? How do we secure our supply? How do we move our supply, which from a farmer livelihoods perspective is negative, but we can get back to that. And effectively, how are we creating this infrastructure to now not just think about the price of the commodity and the quality, but also the sustainability metrics? And it's not before you could just get fair trade or whatever it was, and it looked nice and it helps your brand and all that sort of stuff. But now we're moving away from just sustainability certification. Now it's data-driven regulatory. Which is, I think, a good progression personally. That's a big one. Second, I would say is that there are a lot of different interventions where the government has to play a role because these are simply public goods. So in the US, and I assume the EU, there are certain data layers that are crucial for farmers, again, sticking on agriculture, like land boundary maps, watershed, soil quality, carbon quality, all those types of things. That's all essentially a public good for the private sector to use, for small farmers to use, whatever it is, in order to build products and services, be smarter and be more intelligent in what they're doing. Most of that doesn't exist on a country-by-country basis because those governments don't have the resources. And so channeling more money for governments to actually build that repository, supporting governments to do it, is really crucial because without that type of information and knowledge and data, simply they're at a huge disadvantage in what they can move forward with. The final thing I'll say is that, again, a lot of the interventions in adaptation, but not all, are really kind of large-scale infrastructure, projects of that nature, right? So government plays a key role in de-risking financing for it, delivering financing, multilateral banks and development finance institutions like the IDB, BII, formerly the DFC in the US, which is still around but a bit quiet these days. All these played a crucial role in underwriting, providing first loss, setting up kind of these vehicles that are larger capital investments so we can create the infrastructure to do these like larger adaptation investments. And a lot of that then ripples to, the stuff we might invest in, right? So the ability for the government to invest in irrigation on a large scale or water infrastructure then allows farmers that, our companies might support to be a bit more resilient to drought and things like that. So they all kind of have to be coordinated, and government, either local or, global through these DFIs, are really crucial in stimulating that.
I think you're very courageous to invest in this space because from what I can hear from you, it's like we need so much collaboration and efforts together to actually deliver something. But to go back to something you just said before, you mentioned the livelihood of the farmers, for example, as being one of the potential negative aspects of this type of new companies and new projects. What's the role of startups and venture capital in terms of making sure that not only we adapt to climate change, but also to actually support the life of those that suffer from it?
I mean, I think, again, there's an economic and then there's a moral argument on this. And so starting at the moral one, I've seen a number of startups that are looking at how do we remove the coffee farmer from the coffee value chain, and we can just create synthetic coffee or coffee substitute, which might make us feel good environmentally. But even in that line of thinking, that farmer's not going away. So either they lose that livelihood, or two, they're just going to go plant something else or chop down the coffee trees and grow something worse or run cattle or something else. So I struggle with some of the, companies or interventions that look at eliminating kind of the supply chain because it kind of either you eliminate a livelihood or kind of a person's ability to earn an income, or secondarily, it fails to account for the fact that that person's still going to farm something, and it's probably not going to be as environmentally positive as what they're doing today. From an economic perspective, like a good company, a good startup always puts the user at the center. And in this case, if you're a company in food systems or agriculture, your user, your customer might be a big brand like Nestle. But actually, one of your main stakeholders is probably that farmer. And actually the one that's maybe the hardest to understand and convince and, get their trust is going to be that farmer. And so I think good startups, and the ones we certainly invest in and back, they have a really good way of engaging with that farmer, getting data consistently around how they're interacting with that product or service, the value proposition they're deriving from it. And all of this is, I haven't said impact once, but it effectively is the impact. So is this farmer's life meaningfully better in terms of higher income, better productivity? Was there a drought and they could weather the drought? Whatever it is, a startup that puts that at the center and figures out how to solve for it are the ones that are going to be successful. Because there's no shortage of ag techs, for instance, that have tried and not paid attention to it, and they don't survive long. No matter who your customer ultimately is, like if you don't really figure out how to deliver value to that farmer, you're not going to be around very long.
And if we go back to that synthetic coffee idea, it's interesting because you're one of the first person that actually says that it's probably not a right idea, because from my perspective, at least, I always thought of it as, okay, like producing coffee creates a lot of CO2, it's not optimized, and maybe there are alternatives where we can actually, create it in the lab or something like that, and actually then deliver it with, smaller supply chain and have less emissions, right? But from your perspective, it might not be a good idea. What would then be a good idea for solving the problem of climate with coffee, for example, right? Because you have a contrarian argument there, right?
I mean, the overall challenge is we don't have any grand chess master who's helping us coordinate and move all the pieces, right? So we have, capital will flow where it flows like water. Like we said, it's easy for it to flow in renewables because we understand the financing. There's an asset you can back. The tech's getting cheaper, more productive, all these things, right? Capital is going to flow where it flows, and everybody makes logical decisions influenced by government and subsidy and other things around that. And sometimes there's a bit of FOMO and herd mentality, but generally speaking, we have to trust the wisdom of the kind of markets on that. In terms of climate interventions, the challenge I think we have is, like, one, what does the science say? What's the actual evidence? And then two, we have a huge portfolio of approaches to reduce emissions, right? And so it's probably easy for me to sit here and say, well, like if we want to attack kind of emissions reductions in supply chains, does it make more sense to eliminate the actual the trees that are growing coffee in this case, and simply make it in a lab? The questions I would have would be, okay, what's the actual emissions from that supply chain to, is it realistic that we can produce it at that scale? I mean, it gets into all these kind of wonky counterfactual arguments where I don't know where we end up. Is it a better intervention or not? But from a livelihoods perspective, that piece of land will exist. It has coffee trees that, will no longer be valuable if we take that extreme example. They will be chopped down or burned, which will reduce emissions. And that farm will move on to something else, maybe palm. Maybe they're going to move on to, probably not palm if it's coffee, but for cocoa, they would move on to palm, chop those trees down, and palm, maybe run some cattle, whatever it is. And is that outcome better than the previous one? And so I think for a lot of food producers, especially coffee and cocoa, the way they're looking at it is not, we want to replace our entire value chain with, something lab grown, which again is very maximalist and not accurate. But if we're going to take that, it's that, how do we actually understand the scope 3 emissions of our supply chain? And because of regulation that requires us actually having data on each farm, how can we be more intelligent and thoughtful about securing our supply chain by working with those farmers to reduce their emissions, invest in their soil, ensure longer livelihood of those trees, sequester carbon at source? And so I think regardless of everything happening in the markets, everything happening in the US, very, some quiet and some loud, all these ag players are saying, let's invest in our supply chains, understand it, and find ways to remove carbon, reduce our emissions in these supply chains. And at the same time, that's good for our soil, that's good for productivity, that's good for us securing, really our business model.
And can you actually invest in social justice and climate at the same time? Is that actually possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because fundamentally, the fundamental truth, once again, is those least responsible in the global south are most affected. And how do you solve unbelievable wrongs that were tangible as well as in climate? I don't claim to have any sort of answer on that. All I can say is, at least with our tools across venture capital and across our grant fund, our intention is to just say we want to give dignity and agency to those founders in Africa and Latin America, and then those in the global north who are working in those markets. We want to give dignity and agency to those people to re-envision those systems that right now are not really working for them, right? So the extractive models of just procuring commodities from these markets, paying farmers a small amount, not really caring about whether those farmers will continue to exist in 5 years, that's done. And we think there are founders out there that are really re-envisioning how financial systems, land use, nature-based solutions, food, all these things can work better for them from a livelihoods perspective, but then also for duration in terms of being, around for climate stresses and shocks.
You mentioned a few things that are interesting, partly because you also have two type of vehicles, one on the grant, one on the venture capital side. But I'd love to get a bit of your perspective in terms of like, how do you look at companies in adaptation, and what are the criteria you use actually to make an investment decision? So maybe let's start with venture capital, and then maybe we can go to grants afterwards. On the venture capital side, what are the metrics, criteria, flags, label, whatever you use to actually make an investment decision in that space?
Yeah, so I think for us, it all starts with our taxonomy. Like every investor, we have a thesis. We have a vision of the world, like I said, where we have been embedded as a team. We've been founders and operators in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa before coming to the venture capital side. And so we ourselves, but then informed by the communities that we're with, the ecosystems we're engaged with, have a vision for, again, what are these food systems, land systems, financial systems, and so forth look like in these countries? We want to invest towards that. We know we're a tiny venture capital player, but the beauty of venture capital is we can make tiny bets and hopefully convince, the Sequoias and Tigers and others, well, not Tiger anymore, but, the others of the world to come in on top of it. And so it starts with that vision, that thesis. And then to get very specific, we have created kind of a taxonomy within that thesis. So what are the business models, tech that we are particularly excited about? What are the ones we're just not going to focus on? It's all on our website that, folks can look at. We're not magicians. Every time we update that taxonomy, an entrepreneur challenges us with something we never knew could possibly exist. And so we're constantly updating it, reflecting on it. It's a living, breathing, adapting document. And so that's really our first foremost. Like, we try to be very thoughtful about how we want to construct a portfolio that really addresses key levers within these systems. So within, say, agriculture, how do farmers understand the quality of their soil? Because that's really crucial if they want to grow more crops, if they want to grow smarter crops. Biologicals, like what are different types of biologicals that help crops to withstand stress from heat, excess rainfall. We really try to figure out what are those key interventions that and technologies and business models that we think should have capital behind them. And then we look at the market and see, are there startups really building these things? And most crucially, and getting to the core of this, I think, is, do we think that these companies really have room for growth, not just in a single country, but across a region and ideally multi-region? And that's usually where, again, we're extremely early, like pre-seed investors in a lot of these contexts, but we want to have founders that have a vision that this can be a product that appeals not to just like 1,000, 1,000 users, 1,000 farmers, whatever it is, but this really could be something across all of East Africa, all of Sub-Saharan Africa, and ideally between two continents, because we think that's the level of scale and growth needed to really make a meaningful dent in the problem.
So basically, if I summarize it, it's like you need a founder with a vision, like a large vision for his company. So ambition, large market, resilience, and a real solution to adaptation. That's like the criteria.
Yeah, and I think we're willing to walk along that journey with founders, because often it's pre-seed stage, they're very early. They might be pre-revenue. There's certain interventions or certain companies, again, where they are just getting started. And we recognize they're going to change their target customer base 5 times before they hit it. So we're more than happy to be very hands-on. Again, all of us have been founders and operators. We have a whole platform team that really tries to de-risk post-investment. Like, what is the core set or suite of tools where we can help these founders be more efficient with their capital, learn from our, other 70 plus portfolio companies. What are the B2B segments we know really well we can make intros in? We want to offer that to the founders that get in our portfolio so that in the very short amount of time they have to get through that valley of death, be as effective as possible and hopefully get there.
And what about the criteria on the grant side? Like, how do you give a grant? How do you decide which company deserves to have a grant?
So on the grant side, with our venture lab is what it's called. Essentially what we're looking for there is first of a kind use cases of new technologies in emerging markets. We want to look at where there's a lot of hype around, say, certain areas, say, I don't know, enhanced rock weathering, biochar, AI agents for ag advisory, things that are very hyped up within the venture capital community, within the climate community, and maybe a bit early from a commercial perspective to invest in. Where can we apply a grant to really not definitively, but where can we apply a grant so that we're able to answer kind of a key set of questions? Does this technology work commercially? What value proposition does it have to its users or stakeholders? And what are its pathways to growth? We've done quite a bit in the Web3 crypto space, actually, in this, which has, the relationship between financial resilience and climate resilience is a longer topic to get into, but intrinsically linked. But there's no greater hype sphere than Web3 and crypto. And so in that grant fund, we've done quite a bit in that space. Like, how do we look at using stable coins to deliver insurance payouts very fast to farmers? Because one of the biggest issues with insurance is you have multiple parties that have to agree upon whether a payout, goes to a farmer if there's a drought or something else. And that sometimes can take upwards of 1 or 2 months. And so if you're a farmer living on nothing, you've just lost your crop, that's time you can't afford. You're not able to regrow your crop. You're not able to sustain your family. You take out loans, go into debt, all the horrible stuff. And so we were doing A/B testing, traditional insurance, not using blockchain on the back end, to do that counterparty kind of agreement on a payout. And then others using blockchain on the back end with smart contracts and then stable coins to provide payouts. And the reduction in cost for the insurance company was something like 95%. The time from payouts went from 30 plus days to I think about 48 hours. I mean, it's a no-brainer. And that to us is the best type of pilot to do in our venture lab, because what we're demonstrating is, does this work? Is it cheaper? Is it more effective? What's the feedback we're getting from a user or farmer? Does this improve the resilience of their lives? And so with the grant side, that's a different process. Essentially with that, we have wide open doors. You don't have to be in a company in our portfolio. We do calls for proposals, I think 3-4 times a year in specific problem sets. We just finished one now in water. So we're looking at scoping, around the world, who's working on water in emerging markets. Are you, reducing water leakage? Are you helping farmers to optimize water usage? Are you creating more water? All types of things. And we just want to be open to any partner. It could be a small, young startup. It could be a giant multinational corporation that wants to address it. And that's how we go through it.
Before getting towards the end of this episode, I think there's something that I would like to address. Maybe it will make you uncomfortable. But I'd love to learn a bit more about the results you had so far from a venture capital perspective. I don't know what you can share or cannot share, but is there any numbers you can share in terms of I basically want to convince people that it actually can generate returns when you invest in adaptation. So what are the numbers you can share?
So from our Fund 1, we've currently made about 60 investments. We have another about 5 to 7 to go in that fund. In the process of our first close for our Fund 2, so I can't really talk about that. Then in our venture lab, we've done another, I think, 25 pilots. So I'll speak across those like 60 investments we've done plus 25 pilots. And the 25 pilots, that's kind of another set of data to give an idea of kind of the scale that they've achieved or results they've achieved, which we feel pretty proud about as an emerging markets fund manager. We do have one unicorn in the portfolio, Wasoko, which is based in Kenya, but operating all across Africa in supply chain resilience and financing. Then we have another I think 10 companies now that are 3 to 5x MOIC. So across our portfolio, and again, to compare apples to apples, we have to look at our emerging markets fund management peers because we can't compare ourselves to like SaaS investing and investing in Airbnb. But generally speaking, we feel pretty good about where we're at. We have again multiples ranging from 3x to about 35x across the portfolio. And again, we think a lot of the kind of latest vintages of investments in climate data analytics, supply chain resilience, nature-based solutions, natural capital, we think those are going to be the ones that really kind of drive returns over the coming 3-4 years. So yeah, we feel good. We've catalyzed another about $550 million in capital, so brought in other investments after into these companies, which again for emerging markets is a significant amount.
No, for sure, and thank you for sharing it. I think not all funds are as willing to share the numbers, but I think those are great numbers for sure, and I think it proves that there is something there in terms of like economic value as well. Look, we're getting towards the end of this episode, but one last section, which is something we always do, is a fire question. So I'll ask you about 10 questions in the next 5 minutes. You'll have 1 sentence maximum per question to answer. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
What's the most overhyped climate tech right now?
I think everything in AI for climate is a bit exuberant at the moment. And that's not a specific sector, but I just think I'm seeing AI thrown at everything, and I don't think it delivers tangible value in a lot of it.
Interesting. What's one adaptation solution that you wish more people knew about?
I think most people look at natural capital, meaning carbon markets and so forth, as a mitigation opportunity in removing carbon. But actually, I think it's the most powerful incentive we have to transition to regenerative land use and reward the global south for really the practices they're mostly already doing.
What's a red flag when you hear a funder pitch?
The biggest red flag for me is not hearing a lot of humility around how that founder is engaging their customers or stakeholders. I think a lot of hubris around how the tech will just sell itself or it just finds its market versus how they're tangibly going to go to market with it and really understand that user and iterate on it.
I love it. Complete the sentence. If adaptation had the same level of funding as mitigation, we would.
If adaptation had the same level of funding as mitigation, I think what we would see is just a really exciting explosion of different tech in the tech stack. This is a longer answer, but because there's not the funding available, there's so many gaps for everything we want to do. And I think we're building it, but I'm impatient about how long it's taking, right? So if adaptation finance was at the same level as mitigation, I think we would start to see a lot more exciting companies that are kind of building the stack that allows for the future of climate smart tech farming, that allows for a proliferation of financial services that allow people to build assets. Like right now, it's quite haphazard, small scale, and it's not coming together in the way that it could. And because it requires that coordination, the whole stack just doesn't quite exist. And so I think it would be pretty exciting. We'd finally realize some of the visions that I think we have for how all these things in a pretty decentralized way actually can build atop each other and become a bit of a flywheel.
Yeah, so much more startups in the space and building exciting things. If you were not a VC, what role would you play in the fight against climate change?
I think I've recognized my role cannot and should not be a voice for our founders, for environmental activists, for all those, right? I'm just a white guy from Chicago. I spent the last 20 years living these places, but that's not my role. I was a founder operator before. I'm on the investment side. If I leave the investment side, which I will at some point, I would like to be an operator and support one of these visionaries to really realize what they do with whatever I have. And so, yeah, I'd like to be on the operator side and just work in one of these companies with a climate lens and just help them be as successful as possible.
Love it. What's one piece of advice for a founder entering the climate tech space right now, like the climate adaptation space? Like if there's something you should tell that person before they actually start a company?
Yeah. I think nothing is better than proximity. Proximity to your users, your customers, really falling in love with the problem, not just specific tangible problem, but what is the system you're operating in, and are you addressing the right lever point in it?
Great. And I guess one last question for you is, what are the three most important things, according to you, to be a great impact investor?
First, I think, again, being a founder operator, it was very frustrating raising from funds that kept shifting their thesis, didn't know what they're doing, and things like that, right? So I think as an impact investor, broadcasting, I'm currently investing, here's how many investments I intend to do, here's what I'm interested in, getting to yes or no as quickly as possible with founders and not wasting their time is number one. Number two, I think we talk about impact management and measurement. A lot of people get annoyed, eyes glaze over, all those types of things. But again, for me, it's all about value prop. Are you increasing income, increasing productivity, whatever it is? We just want to understand the value proposition you're delivering. And I think a smart impact investor uses impact measurement as a way to understand, does this company actually deliver value? And so that's crucial too. Otherwise, you're just investing kind of in greenwashing or the potential impact, but you don't actually know if you're delivering value. Then third, I think, impact investing is still a tiny sliver of the whole capital markets. I think impact investors taking a clear lens around how do they add additional value to get these companies to scale. That's both supporting these companies with whatever you have available to help them scale internally, and then two, having to send signals to later stage investors to pull in capital. It's not enough just to place bets and feel good with yourself. You really have to convince later stage capital that this is the place to be in.
I love it. Well, look, we are at the end of this episode. Before we finish this episode, there's a few questions. One, if people want to reach out to you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me email. tran@mercycorps.org. We're always happy to hear pitches directly.
Great. And then the last question for today is, who's the next person that should be in your seat? Ideally, like an impact partner at a VC firm.
I think the work that AXA's natural capital team is doing really is vanguards of investing in natural capital across the tech stack, but then specifically natural asset managers, project developers is crucial and really interesting. And I think the long term of our environmental markets and our survival as a human species demands that becomes a robust asset class, and AXA is really ahead of the game. And they're an insurer, so they see a commercial reason to invest in this space. So I think they're pretty fantastic.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for today. As a quick summary of this episode, I think we've learned that there is a lot of economic potential in adaptation solution in emerging markets, which those two words together might scare a lot of people. But I think you've proven through your model that it's possible to actually make money. You have one unicorn in your portfolio. You have great returns from 3x to 35x, if I remember correctly. So I think, that I think is a testament to It's possible. You can do it. And otherwise, listeners, if you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or give us a 5-star review and a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This really helps the show. So thank you so much for those that will do it. Thank you so much. Again.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.